All right, so we're live. My name is Kimberly. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of For Harriet, and I am so excited to be joined by Candice Benbow and Candice Simpson for a talk about Black church sex. I'm so excited to have a really candid and frank discussion on faith and female pleasure. So thank y'all for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yay!
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I have to do, since this is, on the church side, we have to do things decent and in order. I have to really give credit to Ahmand Greene-Hayes for creating the hashtag Black Church Sex last week. I thought it was really, really compelling, and I thought it would be a really perfect discussion for the For Harriet community. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I'm interested to hear your church background. So, yeah. So Candace,
You went in and out for me. So which one of us do you want first?
Simpson.
Okay.
Okay. So my church background, was that the question?
Yeah.
I am a church kid. I grew up in the church. I can imagine and remember every single holiday. I can remember every single church sermon. I can remember every single experience in the church. And the church is really where I learned more about my identity as a Black person in this country. So for me, I really do hold on to the church and its potential because for so many of us, it has helped us to forge and make sense of our identities as people in this nation. I'm also, I think by accident, found myself in seminary. If you ask me what I'm doing here, I really have no idea. But I know that I'm really excited and I'm really happy to learn and to put myself in a position where I can do a little bit more of the work that has made such a difference in my life and the life of others. So.
Um, Again, thank you for having me. I am a church girl too. So I was born and raised Zion Hill Missionary Baptist Church, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and home church is St. Stephen Missionary Baptist Church. Was baptized at St. Stephen. I grew up going to Lot Carey, summer camp, um, was an unofficial secretary for the senior usher board because my grandma was an usher, and I did absolutely everything in church. My parents were never married, and so my mom was a single mom raising me in the church context. And I think for me, I know for a fact that my social, my intellectual, my political prowess I got because I was a church girl. I was one of the ones, and this is as good as it was for me, still very problematic. I was one of the ones in the church that they liked. So I got to do read scripture. I got to do announcements. I got to do all of these things in the church that allowed me to find my voice and find and develop leadership skills. And so when I think back, I always knew from that moment that I was always going to be a leader because I was pushed in church. Um, I didn't know that I would be a preacher simply because I just didn't see women preachers growing up. And so even though I felt a different kind of tug and a different kind of pull, I suggested to myself or talked myself out of that being a tug and a pull to the pulpit. And then going through grad school and as an adult, I've never really ever left the church, even if I've like stepped away or taken a moment away to just heal from something that may have happened in the church. I've always been a church girl. For good and for bad, I can never see myself leaving it. And so I think that that's why, like Candace said, um, we are as passionate about critiquing the church because we want it, we want it to be not only a life-giving space for us, but for the generations that will look to the church for the same things that we got from the church.
Right. Right. And, I've talked a little bit about my relationship to the church. There was a surprisingly popular video that I made probably about 6 months ago about why I was deciding to take a break from the Black church. But I'm back now. I go to church regularly now. But I still feel very conflicted about the theology that I encounter. I feel conflicted about the gender politics that I encounter. But I am so deeply invested in the church, specifically the Black Christian church, that I'm not willing to walk away. I'm not willing at this point to concede that the church is only for misogynists, that the church is the domain of homophobia. So now I feel deeply invested in seeing change, and I am not called to preach at all. But I think that there are ways that we can question and we can cajole outside of it. I am committed to that. So let's go ahead and get right into it. What did the church teach you about your sexuality? What teachings about sex did you get early on?
So again, I context everything in the fact that I found out that sex was wrong in the church because I found out that my mother and my father had sinned. And there's a very vivid memory I have of one of my Sunday school teachers just basically telling me that my mother, had conceived me in sin. And so growing up hearing sermons, sitting through I don't know how many purity classes, learning that if my parents had just obeyed God more, I wouldn't even be here, right? So I was never. It's always for me, and I shared this with friends and they agree. It was almost this unspoken rule that you were supposed to wait until you were married. That like the conversations about sex that I even heard in the church came like late teens and when I was in college because that was the rise of like purity movement, true love waits type stuff. But as like middle school, elementary school, I never heard anything about sex. It was just assumed that I would wait until I was married and that whatever understanding, conversations, knowledge about sex that I needed in that moment that I said I do and then a ring gate on my finger, it would somehow like be downloaded to me from on heaven, from on high, and like I would know things, but like I never got sex conversations in church.
Right.
I would have to echo what Candace said, and I think it depends on what we mean by did the church teach me something. So you have the church, which is the explicit, I mean, we can define the church as like the explicit and formal body of the church, the congregation, the ministries that meet on the Wednesdays, the pastor, etc., the denomination, things like that. And then there's church people. Right. And I would say church people are like this amorphously powerful blob of people who do churchy things, but they aren't necessarily grounded in the tradition or the discipline of the church. And I think, maybe a analogy would be, you've got like Tyler Perry movies that are churchy and they do really well with church people. And then you have like actual scripture, which those are two different things. But, the people where I think there's a lot of power is in this church people question. And so church people have had a lot to say about sex. I'm very interested in I love to read Facebook comments. I love to read Twitter threads, and it's the same people who like will post really inspirational quotes or like post scriptures or hymns or whatever, who do have like these really weird like shaping ideas about what sex is. But I would agree with Candice that like as far as the explicit church, as far as like the formal organized space, there hasn't been as much of a conversation about sex or sexuality, which is why I think Ahmad's hashtag was so brilliant, because it gets people to start talking. And I watched people who, seminarians, you've got clergy, you've got layfolk, you've got all different kinds of people, teens, just all different kinds of people talking on the people's media, on Twitter. And then, you watch people kind of have this skepticism of like, oh, well, is it me or is it my fault? And so that's people navigating, are they the church or are they church people? And who are you responsible to? So I think the problem is, and I think that's what we're noticing with the power of this hashtag, is that there isn't much of an explicit conversation. And definitely when there are explicit conversations about sex and sexuality, they are very dangerous, and they can be the furthest thing from life bringing and life giving.
Right. So I'll say I've encountered explicit conversations, but like you said, Candice, those conversations were about sin. They were about shame. And we're never talking about pleasure, right? So I think I'm interested in specifically, right? So maybe even if we're not talking about teachings, explicit, like biblically rooted teachings, I'm interested in what quote unquote church people, what messages they're sending you about sex and pleasure and the place for sex and sexuality in your life.
Well, I mean, it was so funny when I saw that you titled this, a dialogue on faith and female pleasure, because I mean, women are not supposed to be pleasured, right? Like, so we're not supposed to experience any type of fulfillment and enjoyment out of intimacy that does not result in a baby, right? Like that is, and even if it hurt, like who cares? Like you're only supposed to have a baby. And so the conversations that the church or even church people have regarding pleasure and women, specifically young Black women who I am most concerned about in my work, is that you're never supposed to enjoy, you're never supposed to be fulfilled, because on some level the way in which that translates is that women are empowered to know what they want for themselves, right? And so a woman is never supposed to be in a state of independence of her own mind and own body that she gets to say, this is not pleasing to me, right? That like, this is not something that I want. And so, because we're not, we don't know what we want for ourselves. Paul tells us that, right? Like, so like we need, God to tell men to tell us what makes us happy, right? So that if we are having a conversation in the church about female pleasure, and it is solely a conversation among women, about women, and for women, about what they enjoy or what they believe is pleasurable and fulfilling to them, that is diametrically opposed to the project of the church. Like the church is not supposed to empower us in that way. So that's never, sadly, a conversation that we'll hear, and we have to go outside of the church to even begin to have those conversations. And part of it, when I say outside of the church, it may be, those secular spaces, or it may be church women because everybody knows like that one, maybe two sisters in the church that are like fringe, You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
That like, they go to church, but like you can go to them and get some information that your mama might not be the one that told you about. And so like, so those clandestine meetings, maybe at their homes or in other places that women are given permission to explore the conversation of pleasure, but pleasure in and of itself denotes an independence for women that the church is not vested in.
Mhm.
Mhm. It's also complicated, even outside of like, um, heterosexual relationships.
Right.
So I remember when the Black church sex, and I knew this was going to happen. When the Black church sex hashtag started, I tweeted my concerns about um, young Black queer church kids. And, I, as an adult, I always knew that I wasn't straight, but as an adult, I came to be much more comfortable saying, oh, yeah, well, I'm queer. Um, and so for me, thinking about like all of those processes and all of those like questions and like wrestlings and tusslings that I had as a child that I didn't really have the language yet to name. I immediately was like, oh my goodness, like I want to find all the kids and like make sure that they're okay. And so at in that in those tweets that I sent, I started to talk about like how this is complicated by queer identity, and not all of the church sex is straight sex. And my mentions just became over flooded with
I'm
men
sure.
who would say things like, um, but a woman and a woman can't conceive, so. And that was the argument. The argument is that like it's not natural, that you need us, and all the other kind of like the fake data that people will give you when they don't want you to name that you are quite fine just knowing exactly what and who you want. But I realized that in that sort of push, when a man says, but a woman and a woman cannot conceive together, what this person is really saying is, oh, you don't need me anymore.
Hmm.
And that is that person saying, well, what was the point of this? I was supposed to be needed. I was supposed to, and men get all these other messages in the church. I mean, think about, there was this, even in the ways that we talk about police brutality, we talk about men as not only an endangered species, but like the people who this movement should center around. So not just their victimhood, but we're also like centering leadership of males. I mean, and so all those things go together.
Right.
So when, a man hears not just that, you might not be interested in him because you are not straight, um, or you just are not interested in him, it presents a whole other threat, which we should really be concerned about coming out of a church space. I would love to see church spaces equip men to talk about um, the fact that women are not theirs. And I've seen it done really well. At my own church, I remember there was a time when during the hymn of invitation, only the men would stand in the front, only the deacons would stand in the front to receive, those who were discerning if they wanted to join the church and join the community. And I remember listening to my dad, who happens to be also my pastor, along with my mom. I listened to my dad wrestle with this question of what does it look like for the woman who's been assaulted by a man to see an entire greeting line of men. And so I listened to him deny that sort of privilege, and say, you know what, let's mix this up. And so now at the hymn of invitation, there are deaconesses and there are deacons. And while that's not like the ultimate endpoint that we have reached it and that we are at some point of some place of, enlightenedness and that nothing wrong happens there, I do think that it's important that if men are in these positions, that they think about what their presentation does to people. And I think there are very simple ways to disrupt that.
And let me say, to piggyback off of what Candace said, and hopefully for pastors who are listening and leadership who are listening, like it's very easy for men to say, okay, for the sister who was being abused, to see these loving men up there gives her a different kind of story and context. And the danger is that women completely get negated in the story, right? That like that there's no use for women at all in the church. Like, I mean, it goes back to even the ways in which we think of Mary. Like, we don't, and I was thinking about this today, we don't see Mary as Jesus's mother. And all of the things in which we envision healthy mothering relationships doing, we see Mary as just the body through which God used to get Jesus here. And so if you see this woman who is integral to our salvation story just as some orifice that can be discarded later, then it sets the trajectory for the ways in which you see women themselves. And so part of it is that, unfortunately, you know, there will be times in which in ministry where men will never be able to connect with women because of some of the issues that have happened to them, and they need to just be okay with that, right? That there's nothing there that they can fix or that they can solve, but there needs to be the space in which women can do the work that we've been doing, you know, to help heal ourselves.
So you mentioned earlier, Candice, Benbow, that finding a liberatory sexuality has to happen outside of church, or it usually happens outside of church. I'm interested in when you began to question what you were being taught, the theology around sex and sexuality that you were being taught.
I think it was probably, if I'm 30, I'm 33 now, Jesus. If I'm 33, so it's probably like when I was around 26, 27. I was finishing up my master's degree program in which I was looking at like social programs in the Black church. And there was my church at the time, they were trying to craft a singles ministry. And I went to the first meeting of the singles ministry, really excited because this particular pastor in my mind was progressive, and I was thinking that they were doing all of these new and inviting things. And the singles ministry was just, it became a Peyton place where they were really trying to like see, it almost felt like they were trying to see how the ratio of single men to single women in the church. So if we can like marry them all off, then we don't really have a problem. And then it also became this conversation about the ways in which women were flawed, and that was why relationships weren't working. And I had just dated a dude who was born and raised in the church, and he was just all kinds of crap. And so I knew that like that wasn't the truth, right? So,
which happens often.
Hello, and you meet them in the church, and that, hello. So I really began to, and then the kicker for me was that some of the same things that I was hearing in the breakout sessions for women only regarding sex were some of the exact same things that the kids were hearing in their Bible studies around sex. And I'm like, here I am, a 27-year-old woman, and you telling me the same things about sex that you're telling my 8-year-old cousin. Mm-hmm. That was a problem for me. And so I, at that time, really began to realize that this was not that there was something off and that there was something wrong. The danger, however, was that I didn't have people around me who were asking some of the same questions. Mm-hmm. And so I had to seek out those questions. And actually, that was at the same time, it might have been more recent than that, but that was at the same time that I decided to like start my own podcast. And Brittany Cooper wrote the piece Single, Saved, and Sexing. And I read that and was like, oh my God, somebody else in the world thinks just like me. That like I didn't have to engage in a level of intimacy, and then sleep with somebody, and then I'm driving home crying my eyes out, you know, or repenting before I leave his house, and he's looking at me like I'm 8 shades of crazy. Like that you know, that there's a way that like I could see my whole self. And so that for me began the process, and it was a long process. Part of it, you know, it's tough when you're born and raised in this context. You're born and raised in this type of space. It led to like, I mean, to this day, I can post something on Twitter or Facebook, and my mama will call me like, "Did you think you really needed to, you know, you needed to say that?" So it becomes, for me, it was a process of realizing that I wasn't the only one with these questions. The other piece that gave me, the other aspect, and I'll say this quickly, that gave me permission to do this was that I got introduced to womanism, and I never, like
Yes.
never in my life heard of of a position in which Black women were at the center and mattered, point blank, period. Like, no, we not getting ready to deviate and say Black women matter
Yes.
if in this context. It was Black women matter, boom, period. And that's the only conversation that we're a part of and that we're interested in. And from that conversation, all from the perspective that Black women matter, everybody gets saved. Like I had never in my life been given permission to see my whole body as that important to God ever. And so for me, a lot of that affirmation didn't initially come from the church. It still doesn't come from the church unless I'm in a space that embraces womanism, or unless I'm on the phone talking to a mentor who is also a leader in the church, who can pray for me and who can love on me. But half the time I'm reading Corinthians and listening to Beyonce and and realizing that like I matter, you know? So for me, it took me knowing that I wasn't alone. It took me giving myself permission to ask questions and to say and to name what was wrong, and to give myself permission to like heal from all of that, because that takes time too.
Yeah. How about you, Candace Simpson?
I think so. I had a different experience. I grew up in a church where I always knew, we always, or at least as long as I've been alive, there were always women ministers on staff. And I know that that's a commitment that, and it's a dangerous commitment in some spaces, to prioritize that, to say that no, like there's no way that we're going to sit here and only be paying men. There's no way we're
Right.
doing that. And so I think for me, I actually remember my freshman year, after the winter break during my freshman year of college, I came home, and one of our residents, she was an incredible woman, an incredible minister. She invited us over to her house, and she invited like women between like 18 and 24, to come over, and we just like had this powerful like arts and crafts session where we made, like artistic, like expressions of ourselves, and we talked about sex, we talked about our bodies, we talked about it in the context of faith. And never at one point did she say, do not have sex. And I think she had the freedom she had the freedom to do that because we were 18 to 24. And so even the question about sex when we talk about young people is very complicated, because, you know, there are the new STD cases, that are showing up like in young people, where we know that like if they just knew how to use a condom, that we wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, it's beyond like the shame that we want to put around like teenage pregnancy. Like this is people's health, you know,
Right.
like and so, but I think, you know, the fact that there was a woman minister on staff at all times told me that my body didn't make me less holy, and that I could have, I do remember, speaking in the church, and I remember like as Candace said, doing announcements and reading scripture. And I remember like my other sisters doing that too. My church sisters doing that as well. I think there are ways that churches can be very intentional about how they engage and how they educate, because this is like an educational institution in different kinds of ways. But I think it really helped to have women on staff who, could look at me and say, okay, do we need to talk about this thing? And like actually talk about this thing with me.
Right.
I'm trying to sit and think of like, has there ever been a time where there hasn't been a time where I've like talked to a minister who's tried to shame me out of anything. And I think more than anything, it's been important for me to listen to women who say that they value my health. And that means.
So do women have to lead that conversation, or can it be women and men when we're talking specifically to young women or women in the church?
I think so. Sometimes men will talk about, and you notice, you can tell who a misogynist is by when they talk about women. And so sometimes, like, I hear, pastors will talk about sex, but they'll talk about it like, y'all need to stop having kids out of wedlock. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's when they talk about the body. And I'm not okay with that. I think, though, if men and if male pastors want to be partners in this work, then I expect that when they open their mouths to talk about women and sexuality, that it is not automatically something that we are being upset about. That we talk about. I would love to see more assets-based language, and I think that male pastors can do that. However, as far as like the relationship building, kind of the questions that I would have about not just my body, but like how my body impacts my faith, I need a woman to do that. And I think what ends up happening, and we see this with protest movements, we see this in business, we see this in all different kinds of arenas, that we're completely fine letting men talk about women's issues. Yeah. And that's just not appropriate. I mean, there are things that we need to have our own time to talk about. The same way they're going to sit around and talk about, let's have a special prayer for the men. If that's the game you're going to play, then we need to have that sort of space too, and that freedom to, empower one another outside of the gaze of men.
Right.
Candice, Benbow, I'm really interested in how do we combat double standards in the church? So if there are explicit teachings about sex and sexuality, in my experience, there are extreme double standards about what gets said to boys about acceptable sex and expressions of sex. Straight boys, right, because of course boys who are queer are erased and, shunned. But I'm interested in how do we break that down? How do we make sure that the teachings that girls receive and boys receive are give us space to be liberated and empowered?
I think the first thing that we do, and I mean, this is so churchy, but I mean, we tell the truth and we shame the devil, right? Like, so part of it is that, which is why they came for our neck and continue to come for our neck on that Black Church Sex hashtag, because when there is a double standard, you call it out, right? Like, somebody tweeted, and it was so, I don't know who he is, but he was like, I can't remember ever attending a celibacy or a purity workshop at a men's conference. And because they don't exist, right? Mm-hmm. So part of it is that they don't exist, and we need to be honest about the fact that the stories and the conversations about sex that are being had in the context around women's bodies are not the same conversations, if at all, that we're having when we come to talk about men's bodies, and that is a problem. And so what needs to happen is, and I tell people this all the time, when people, so what usually happens is that somebody will ask me this privately, that they have either their child is in one class at Bible study and their daughter or son is in another class, and they're hearing about these double standards, or they're hearing sermons that are problematic. And the first thing that I tell them is go to leadership. Go to leadership and tell them, you know, when this was preached or when this was said, I felt some kind of way, and I felt like this was being that the double standard that is at play is being perpetuated in these conversations or in these sermons or in these studies. What it does not suggest, and I tell people this all the time, it doesn't mean that pastor is going to A, receive it well, unfortunately, B, change their approach. But what it does say is that somebody is listening and this ain't right, right? And then you have, what I tell people all the time, you have a decision to make if it persists. Is this a space that I want to be in? Unfortunately, as Black women and as queer Black folk, like unfortunately, sometimes we have to select churches based on which church, if it's 4 Sundays out of the month, which church ain't gonna piss me off 50% of those Sundays. like we literally have to select churches based off of that, right? And so what I tell people is you need to decide if this church is gonna be death dealing to you, or if at some point it is gonna be life affirming. There are some churches, because they persist in the double standard, because they persist in some of the most, you know, hypocritical and demeaning theology, that I cannot allow myself to even attend or support any of their ministry, right? And so, because it would be death dealing to myself. And so the way that we combat that is that A, we let them know that it's not right and we're listening, and if it continues, is this a place that I want to be a part of? We can't continue to give certain ministries our money, our time, our talents, and all of our resources when they give none of that back to us.
Mm-hmm. So, Candice Simpson, I'm interested in your thoughts, because from what you're saying, you come from a pretty progressive church space, like a really interesting and progressive faith space. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what that looks like practically.
I think a lot of it is about listening, and it's about relationship building. And again, like, I don't think any church is perfect, but I am beyond happy where I am. And I think, it is totally about listening to what people are saying. And I think it's important for us to listen to the oppressed of the oppressed. Because as Candace mentioned, womanism is about recognizing that when when Black women get free, like, all these other systems they will disintegrate.
Right.
I mean, because you think about like all the things that are tied up in that. So when we were tweeting during the Black Church Sex hashtag, I just put out a tweet like, to the young queer Black church kids, if you've ever felt like you are a sin or an abomination, DM me. I got you. And the messages that I got were heartbreaking. I mean, like, one of them had me like up at night. You just listen to how children want a community. And we can extend, the question not just, for queer Black kids in the church, but also, for kids who, they're being talked about, the kids who, the church mother says she's fast, the church kid who, deacon, always, pull down your fix your shirt, or you're coming out of your top, those sorts of comments. For those who are deemed sexually deviant, there's an even greater need for community. And so to listen to like what our kids are saying, they know that, like, or they believe that God is awesome. They believe that, like, the feelings that they feel in church is pretty cool. They know that they like to see their parents happy. They know that they believe in some sort of tethering in an intentional community. And in many different ways, like the church provides that space. So when you take that from kids, when you take that from anybody, you know, of course you're gonna see like all different kinds of like behavior that we will code as, oh, that she's acting out, or, you know, I mean, in the education, you know, in ed reform, people talk about like dropouts. But what we really know to be happening is that they're being pushed out. The same way as happening, you know, in the church. These are not people who, you know, if church is this good thing that we're talking about, why would people want to be away from it? It means that we push them away. And I think that there's and the only reason why I still belong to any church is because I think that its potential is so much greater than what we have messed up in. And so I think, you know, there are ways for people who consider themselves church folk, whether that's, you know, and it's not just clergy. I mean, this goes to the church people. And I think there's so many other kinds of movements that need to happen alongside, you know, this radical like consciousness raising in the church. And so this particular hashtag is one part of this bigger puzzle. You know, there was a study that came out about, you know, there are less people who consider themselves, you know, any kind of theist. And so for some churches, I noticed that kind of scared them, where they're like, oh my goodness, like people aren't coming to church. But actually, this is a prime moment for the church to do some serious reconstruction. This is a time when people can say, okay, something is not right. Who have we pushed out, and what does that do to people? I mean, in terms of numbers, it makes sense to have as many people in your space as possible. It makes sense to have as inclusive a place as possible. So I'm really glad that study came out, because it kind of puts a fire up under us to think about what are we doing to people, and how are we distorting this image of God? Because if God is all these great things, and if Jesus is all these great things, and if all these other stories are so awesome, then why have we hurt so many people? And that means that we are doing that.
And can I just say too that part of this is that our congregations, and this is for whatever pastors or leaders are listening, like our congregations are not as naive and as limited in their thinking as we want to suggest that they are, for several reasons, because people are dealing with these in their families, right? So I mean, case in point, like I preached Mother's Day, and two grandmothers came up to me after service. One grandmother telling me the story of how she was a single teen mom and never was able to say anything to anybody in the church about this, being shunned about this. Another grandmother says, can you give me resources, because I am raising my granddaughter, and she just told me that she's lesbian. She said, I don't ever think I'm going to agree with homosexuality. She said, but that's my grandbaby and I love her. So part of it, and when I talk to other friends, they are hearing some of the same thing, especially youth pastors. Now, because some folks may never ever come to the pastor and tell people stuff, but when you are a youth pastor, you are in a position where you're dealing with the children, they're going to tell you things. And so our congregations are not as unwilling and resistant to begin to have conversations that will shift the direction that we want to suggest that they are. There's a way in which we can begin conversations recognizing that sexuality doesn't exist in some vacuum, right? That I mean, we go into family reunions every year, and somebody bringing a new baby, and we ain't going to weddings, so we know somebody is getting it in. You know what I'm saying? Like that, like queer children live in people's homes. They go there. You're buying them Christmas gifts. You're buying them birthday gifts. Like they are a part of our lives and our families. And so church folk are dealing with questions and conversations about sexuality in their homes. And pastors need to quit using the excuse that their congregations are not ready for it, and just admit that they're not interested in pushing a dialogue further that would challenge the way that they preach and teach. I think she froze on us.
That's all right. I mean, I do think that question of like how people teach and preach is important. I know there was a For Harriet article that went pretty viral talking about, it was really just like a digital glossary of terms.
Right. Yeah, I remember
And
that one.
oh my God. So like I talked about it with like a bunch of church folk, and it was fascinating to me because a lot of these words are very confusing to people. And
Right.
so I acknowledge that from where I sit, that I'm in a place where I know a lot of words, and I know like there's jargon. Any kind of underculture, any kind of subculture is going to have its own language, its own lingo that becomes so alienating that yes, grandmothers and uncles and aunties will be like, what is that? Like,
Yeah.
for example, like I do identify as queer, but I date men, and people are confused by that.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't identify as one thing, and so like a lot of queerness gets absorbed in the optics of what it means to be in a partnership with a man. And I realize that I have to explain that to people. I realized, during a lot of maybe around like August, September, when people started talking about and protesting around Michael Brown, which becomes problematic in many different ways,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the erasure of Black girls and women. I noticed that a lot of Black women who are church people would talk about, oh yeah, like we got to save the Black men because like families. And I'm like, wait a minute. That like a man is not necessarily like integral to my family, perhaps in the future, but the assumptions that we're making is that a man must be present and that we're centering justice around men. And so I think but it's so hard to explain that to someone when you're not a part of that community.
Right.
And so I can have that conversation with a deaconess, or I can have that conversation with an usher or another church member because we love each other and because we know each other, and I have access to her, she has access to me. But I think what's happening is that people have been so pushed away from the church, and people who are doing really good work about sex and sexuality, gender, all different kinds of things, have been pushed outside of the church. And so how do we have these great conversations other than like the purity conversation? There's a reason
Right.
why that conversation has stayed in the church, because those are certain kinds of church people.
Right. And
So
then,
now I'm kind of interested in, okay, so we've talked about how we've integrated the teachings that we found outside of the church into Christian women, but the thing that always comes up when I try to have these conversations is, where's that in the Bible, right? So you're talking
mm-hmm.
all this stuff as, a Black Christian woman, but it ain't biblical. So I'm interested in y'all who've studied it. What are the biblical foundations for embracing an empowered, liberated sexuality as a Black woman?
Okay, so I just have to say this because first off, since we're talking about womanism, Renita Weems is a brilliant womanist biblical scholar.
Mm-hmm.
And she does a lot of work. She helped me through her scholarship to think about Song of Solomon, which
Yes.
is, girl, okay. So I don't know why I never read that text before seminary. And I think it was maybe like October or November because this was my first year. So I'm like, wait, what the hell? Like, what? Song of Solomon is such a full text.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't tell like if the author is talking to her lover, if she's using romantic language to talk about God. I mean, the ways that and it's a very sexy text. She talks about, I will kiss him with the kisses of my mouth. Like, what? Like, you don't see that anywhere else. And it's a powerful text that often gets, it's not in anybody's liturgy. You're not going to hear it on, Women's Day. People won't really talk about sex in that form. We do talk about sex, everybody knows about like Bathsheba. Everybody knows about, Jezebel.
Incorrectly.
Right, exactly. Exactly. But I mean the church people
Right.
know these stories. So I think definitely Song of Solomon is one of those texts that just, it really helps me to, and there's also like some questions about race in there too, which Renita Weems talks about also. But yes, Song of Solomon.
Yeah, so Song of Solomon, and I just reached over and found it. So when I began seminary and really began to deal with knowing that part of my work would deal particularly with the ways in which we talk about sexuality, one of my friends told me about this book called Unprotected Texts, the Bible's Surprising Contradictions About Sex and Desire, and it's by Jennifer Wright Nuss. And she is a Bible scholar and ordained Baptist preacher who teaches at Boston University School of Theology. That book helped to open up for me that that scriptures do not have, the Bible does not have one universal position on sex. Like, as much as we want to say that we can look to all of these scriptures to say that you should wait until you are married to have sex, that's not true. One, because of the stories in the text, right? Like, so we love talking about Esther and the king, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact of the matter is Esther became queen because old boy spent the night with her, and whatever she did, it was better than what the ones who came before her did. She put it on them. Like, or not even, no, I'm not even gonna say that because that violates her. But the fact that he enjoyed sex with her more than he enjoyed sex with the women who came before her. Or the fact in which when we have conversations about Ruth and Boaz, we do not talk about the ways in which Naomi orchestrated a situation in which Boaz had no choice after having been pleasured by Ruth other than to say yes, right? So, or then we talk about Bathsheba. Like, he raped that woman while and took complete and total advantage of her while she was bathing. He knew she was married. He knew, so there's all of these very or Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. There are all of these examples in scripture where this waiting until you are married to have sex, having sex with only one person, is not what is in the text, right? So part of it, and I will be forever indebted to Bishop Yvette Flunder, because she said this last year when I heard her speak at Princeton. She said, Paul does not, in any space, Paul does not say that there should be no slaves. She said Paul teaches us how we are to treat slaves. She said, and so we have had to always read ourselves into the love of God. Mm-hmm. And that is the same thing that we find here when it comes to sexuality. There are contradictions in the biblical narrative about the ways in which we as women, we as men, we as cisgender, we as transgender are supposed to engage around our bodies. And so because of that, we have to read into the text that with all of my stuff, I am still beloved of God, right? That despite who I sleep with, who I choose to be with, that is not the totality of who I am. That I am still beloved of God, and that God still has planned purpose for my life. That it is not limited to who I engage in sex. That may not sadly be biblical, but that's truth, right? And so part of what this conversation, unfortunately, which is why several of us, I'm at the point where I'm not, I refuse to debate scripture with some folks when it comes to conversations like this, because for every scripture that they can give me that tells me what a man and a woman are supposed to do, I can give them scripture that can negate that and can nuance it. And so I'm not having conversations about scripture because one of the things that my mother told me was that God could not be confined to those 66 books. So God's love is too big, too wide, too expansive for me to limit it just to the ways in which some people articulated it in the scripture. So at some point for me, we have to move beyond these conversations and suggest, as Dolores Williams says in Sisters in the Wilderness, and even Phyllis Triple does it in Texts of Terror, there are some parts of scripture that are just bad, and they are not liberative, and they do not affirm who God is. Mm-hmm. However, in scripture and in other places, we have been given the tools to affirm to young people, to affirm to women, to affirm to men, that even if you cannot find yourself in this right now, you can read yourself, your God's love for you into the text, because God still loves you. So some conversations about biblical, I'm gonna be like, okay. I mean, you got a Bible, you went to Lifeway Christian, you bought some books from whoever. I got a whole bunch of books and from a whole bunch of people too. But there, at some point, there has to be a conversation about, am I using the text in a way that frees people, or am I using a text in a way that oppresses people? And if you are committed to freeing people, then you are committed to saying whatever they look like, whatever they're doing, whatever they are engaged in, it does not matter, because God's love is what unites us.
Okay, well, that is a phenomenal point to wrap it up on. So thank you so much, Candice Simpson and Candice Benbow, for sharing your insight and for sharing your knowledge with us. That was a wonderful, wonderful way for us to continue conversations that we like to have at For Harriet about what it means to be a Black woman, to help us contextualize our experience as we move through the world. And so again, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are on social media. You're on Twitter, so shout out your Twitter handles. I tweeted them from For Harriet, but tell the people who aren't following us.
Go ahead, Candace.
Oh, I'm at Candy Cornball.
And I'm at Candice Benbow.
All right, so be sure to visit forharriet.com, and we have these conversations every day. This is what we do. So, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Noche.